Okay, let's talk about salamanders. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and this is another Getting Started in Warhammer 40k video. This is going to be a little bit of a continuation of the Getting Started with Space Marines video that I posted a couple weeks ago. In that video, I described how to start a generic Space Marine list and focused on the Ultramarines chapter, being the chapter with the greatest variety of playstyles available out of Codex-compliant chapters that use the Space Marine Codex. But today we're going to be talking about another Codex-compliant chapter, that being the Green Armored Salamanders. These are the green armored onyx-skinned Space Marines of the 18th Legion. They are a first founding chapter that was created before the Horus Heresy, and their doctrine focuses heavily on close-range combat, especially that using flame and melta weapons. They tend to be a fan favorite within the Warhammer 40k community because they have a concern for civilian life, going above and beyond to reduce human casualties during their engagements. On the tabletop, Salamanders do tend to focus on these close-range attacks, and have several abilities that buff their preferred weapon styles, these namely being flamer weapons and melta weapons. Now, as a Space Marine chapter, Salamanders are one of the many options that you can choose when you are creating your Space Marine army. When you construct a Space Marine army, you can choose a chapter keyword, and you can select special units using that chapter keyword, but it excludes you from taking any other chapter units. So, for example, playing a Salamanders army, we play with all the normal Space Marine rules. However, we get access to Salamander special characters, but give up access to characters out of chapters such as Ultramarines. In this case, the Salamanders use two unique characters, these being Vulcan Heston and Adrax Agatone. Now, both of these characters help support the Salamander's preferred game plan in their own particular ways. Adrax Agatone is a resilient and powerful melee combatant. He has one of the most powerful melee buffs for his leadership ability, and also hits extremely hard in melee by himself. Vulcan Heston is much more of a force multiplier, however, granting the army its thematic buff to melta and flamer weapons by being able to select an enemy target and grant you wound rerolls against that target with weapons using those keywords. Now, this is particularly synergistic in Salamanders, since Salamanders are a Codex-compliant Space Marine chapter. As we discussed in the previous video, this means that they will get +1 to wound when targeting their Oath of Moment target. This means you can expect absolutely immense damage out of things like melta weapons when you are combining all of these effects, potentially giving them hit rerolls, +1 to wound, and wound rerolls, and any additional strength characteristic modifiers or other bonuses that we can apply to that make Salamanders one of the most deadly and high damage subfactions within Space Marine chapters. While this game plan obviously focuses on very close range attacks, this does mean that Salamanders can have an absolutely prodigious amount of damage at that short range, but the difficulty is going to be delivering its fighters to that distance. Now, given that this video is meant for new players, I will caveat new players when selecting their chapter that many chapters are more difficult to play than others, and Salamanders do kind of fall into this category. While they do seem fairly straightforward, wanting to get up close and personal to their opponent and absolutely burn them to death, that is a relatively difficult ask in Space Marines, since it is a faction that is of medium or in some cases below average maneuverability. So if you really want to play Salamanders, just keep in mind that you will be maybe in an uphill battle compared to some other Space Marine chapters. However, that is not to say that Salamanders are particularly bad or weak in any way. It will just require you to get some reps and learn the faction's unique mechanics. So with that, let's dive in and talk about some list compositions. First off, I want to start with a combat patrol, and in this case, I actually racked my brain pretty hard because there are several pretty powerful Space Marine combat patrols that are relatively synergistic with the units that Salamanders have access to. In this case, however, we're going to go ahead and stay with the Dark Angels combat patrol as we did in the previous Ultramarine video, because it gives you the greatest selection of useful models that you're going to be using in a wide variety of list builds. This is the Vengeful Brethren Combat Patrol, and comes stock with 10 Intercessors, a Gravis Armored Captain, 5 Hellblasters, as well as 3 Blade Guard Veterans. We can find uses for all of these models inside a Salamander's army, so this is a pretty strong place to start. So let's talk about expanding this Combat Patrol to an Incursion level army. This is 1,000 points, and is the smallest game size that Games Workshop recommends beyond the Combat Patrol system. At this point, we have to choose our detachment. And I did consider for a while recommending that we do start with the Gladius Task Force like we did with Ultramarines, but I think I would be lynched in the comment section if I didn't recommend that we start with the very Salamanders coded and pretty synergistic detachment, the Firestorm Assault Force. This is a very aggressive, short-ranged, focused detachment that uses a lot of transport mechanics to get its units up close and personal with their targets, and it has huge buffs for weapons that get as close as we want to be doing with Salamanders. There's a reason that this has been designed essentially around the Salamanders chapter, and that is largely because it is focusing on the same weapon types that Salamanders are already trying to play. This detachment gives everything in your army assault that allows you to advance and fire your weapon so you can close more quickly with your target. Once you're within 12 inches of your target, which is the optimal range for a lot of things like flamers and melta weapons, you will also gain +1 strength. And in a lot of situations, this can push your weapons to a break point that will give them usually +1 to wound, which you can also combo with the natural +1 to wound you can get from Oaths of Moment, or even stratagems from the detachment like Crucible of Battle for an additional +1 to wound. Improving your strength in this way can then combo with actual wound bonuses in a very synergistic manner. The detachment also has a lot of transport synergies, and that's largely how we're going to be trying to get our close range units up to the fight, using units like Land Raiders and Impulsors to deliver our very powerful short-ranged infantry. Transports are a little complex in Warhammer 40k, so I definitely recommend that you brush up on the transport rules before we get into this. I have a whole video on how transports work in Warhammer 40,000, so I recommend that you get started over there. Now, what we're adding to this army are going to be, first thing, a pair of Impulsors. These are Primaris transports that are just pretty good for being a cheap, relatively resilient transport option that can carry up to 7 Primaris infantry. This can be a unit of 6 infantry models plus an attached character, which we're going to be doing because we're going to expand the 3 Blade Guard veteran that are included in the combat patrol from a unit of 3 up to a unit of 6. We want to do this because we're going to add the Salamander special character, Adrax Agatone, who has one of the most powerful melee improving leadership abilities in the game, giving his attached unit full wound rerolls in melee. The Blade Guard veterans are particularly synergistic here because they can give themselves reroll 1s to hit in melee with one of their combat stances. That's going to benefit Adrax, who already hits on a 2, to be hitting on 2s and rerolling, meaning he's going to hit most of his attacks, and then they will also gain their wound rerolls. You can use the stratagem Crucible of Battle for +1 to wound in melee as well, which means that these guys don't necessarily need Oath of Moment to be at the highest potential efficiency against their target. They can do that with stratagems and their own abilities and get a very similar level of efficiency. That lets us set up our Oaths of Moment to apply to some of our other units like the Hellblasters that are also included inside the combat patrol. We're going to be assigning these guys to a second Impulsor over here to give them the opportunity to get up in close and personal in melee. They also can use the Transport's firing deck as well to use their ranged attacks out of the top of the vehicle, which just adds additional flexibility to this unit. That said, the Hellblasters don't really get huge benefits from the detachment ability. They already have Assault, and going from Strength 8 to Strength 9 is only in some situations a big benefit to these guys, so we're not really focusing too heavily on the Hellblasters for this Firestorm Assault force. Now, in addition to that, we've also added a Scout Squad to the army. I talked in my previous video about how useful Scout Squads are for securing secondaries and forcing your opponent to engage with you in the early game, so I'm not really going to go into too much detail on how important these units are, but just keep in mind that these guys are going to be very important for scoring. We also then have 2 Invader ATVs. Now, these are going to be the primary source for our multi-melta attacks inside the army. This is a huge benefit once we start expanding up to the Strike Force game size level, the 2,000 point level, because that's when we're going to try to synergize them with Vulcan Heston. In the meantime, though, they are extremely inexpensive and very difficult to kill for their points value little mounted unit. They're a little bit tough to maneuver because they can't go through ruined terrain wall like infantry units can. However, they have a relatively high base movement characteristic, and with Assault from the detachment ability, they can skirt around terrain features fairly reasonably. We're taking 2 of those guys, and they can kind of combo with our Scout Squad to give us some utility units that can skirmish with our opponent, force them to come into the center of the table, and then potentially allow us to counterattack them with our close-range infantry units like our Blade Guard veterans. Now, when playing an army like this build, we're going to be focusing on what's called an MSU, or multiple small unit style of strategy. This is a strategy that typically tries to gain value by essentially stacking multiple smaller attackers onto a single target in order to overwhelm them and give our opponent so many targets to attack that they will have difficulty removing them all. Cheap transports like the Impulsor are kind of the core of a lot of strategies like this, because once they have an attached unit inside, they essentially make the unit 2 to 3 times as difficult to remove. Since you have to kill the impulsor, you then give the defender, the controlling player of the transport, the opportunity to disembark, potentially in a position where the attacker can't see them. Then they have to go root out the defending unit that's inside the transport. A lot of times what we want to be doing here is, similar to the Ultramarine list that we played, is force our opponent to come engage with our Space Marines by using our cheaper utility units like the Space Marine Scouts as well as the Invader ATVs to score secondaries and threaten control of objectives before we have to commit our larger units. It's important also to consider the impulsors essentially as another utility unit. They're just fine at scoring points themselves, and if we need to in a pinch, we can use them to move up and take objectives, hold down objectives, or even perform actions, if depending on what we're drawing in our tactical secondaries. Now, when deploying this army, I'd always keep the Blade Guard veterans and Adrax inside a transport. They really have a tough time getting themselves into melee without any sort of movement improvement. In addition, the Hellblasters also want to be inside one of these transports as well, for all the reasons that I mentioned earlier. Now, unfortunately, our Gravis Captain doesn't have anything to attach to inside the combat patrol, and it's very difficult to fit Gravit's units into an Incursion-sized game. We will be using him as more of a competent leader in the future, but as it stands, he's a relatively difficult character to kill. We can even improve that further inside Firestorm Assault Force with enhancements like Adamantine Mantle, although to some extent it doesn't really affect that many attacks, since it means that you'd need a minimum of 3 damage to attack him for it to come into play. The Gravis Captain already halves incoming damage, which makes him very resilient to begin with, and adding Adamantine Mantle will also reduce that damage by 1. That would mean that a 3 damage attack, for example, would be halved first down to 2 damage and then reduced by 1 down to 1, which is a high level of resilience, but a lot of times what he's doing is getting attacked by 1 or 2 damage attacks, which will kill him anyway, so you don't necessarily need that. You can also take the War-Tempered Artifice enhancement to give him additional strength in melee, and that makes his melee attacks particularly powerful. And in this case, we can keep him in strategic reserve and use the Rapid Ingress stratagem using his Rites of Battle for free to place him 6 inches away from the table edge at the end of your opponent's movement phase. If your opponent's moved up into an aggressive position, for example, we can use this little guy to hop in 6 inches off of a table edge, something like this. Make sure he's not in line of sight, or at least not in line of sight of anything that's dangerous, and then we can use him to move forward and counterattack enemies that are trying to push onto his side. These little Gravis Captains are pretty effective in that capacity, and they're definitely, especially at low points games, not too bad by themselves. Now, with all that being said, I think it's important to discuss how we can utilize transports to both deliver our troops to the fight and also retain control of objectives even through enemy shooting. A lot of times what we're going to be doing is pushing up our light units like our scouts and ATVs early, but we also want to threaten control of objectives on round 2 onwards with the impulsors themselves. As I mentioned before, for their cost, the impulsors are not that easy to kill. They have an invulnerable save if you equip their shield dome, and you can use defensive stratagems on them as well. Now, let's say, for example, our opponent is trying to remove them and wants to remove control of our objective by destroying the impulsor. Any embarked units inside will disembark 3 inches away or wholly within 3 inches of that transport. What we can do is actually use that distance to give ourselves some space, put ourselves on the transport, and potentially put ourselves in a position where it's difficult for the opponent to see us. So for that reason, it's always important to keep in mind where your units could potentially disembark when you're setting up your transports, and remind yourself that you want to have a position available for them where they can at least disembark into cover or potentially disembark out of line of sight. Getting them behind a ruined terrain feature is the best way to do that, and even putting them in situations where your opponent is forced to move out and attack the impulsor so that you don't score points, but then you can disembark a particularly valuable unit in an aggressive position, even if it's not necessarily on the objective itself, but you can put them somewhere where they are threatening the rest of your opponent's army. Something like this potentially can be extremely dangerous. In this case, even if the impulsor dies, assuming that our opponent can't get line of sight to the remaining Blade Guard veterans, that then puts the Blade Guard and Adrax Agatoni in a position to push even farther up the table in the subsequent turn. So making sure that you have positions where your models can safely disembark from when your transports are killed is an important part to playing these things. In addition, you can also use them to increase the threat range of your units. For example, even if we have an impulsor in a pretty relatively safe spot like behind this ruined terrain feature, however our opponent is moving up to threaten control of this objective, we can use the 3-inch disembarkation from the transport to then act as basically 3 additional inches of movement for the unit. It's important to keep in mind that you have to disembark your unit fully before you start moving models, so when your units disembark from a impulsor like this, you're going to be in a formation that looks something like that. You're not necessarily in a big blob, which might make your melee a little bit tougher, but getting that extra movement up the table is really good, because now we can have a pretty easy charge on enemies that are even hiding relatively far away from the objective marker. So in some cases, it's very very valuable to keep your impulsors threatening control of objectives, and in some cases, especially for units like the Blade Guard veterans, the impulsors are very valuable for their ability to safely transport these big beefy units up to an aggressive position on the tabletop. Now, even if your infantry like your Hellblasters or your Blade Guard veterans are moving up and disembarking from your impulsors, you can then re-embark your intercessors. These guys are particularly valuable in transports because if the transport is able to disembark them onto an objective when it's destroyed, assuming that unit then clears its battle shock on the subsequent turn, which it should if it hasn't taken any casualties automatically, then the intercessors with their objective secured will lock in that objective for you. There are 2 units of 5 intercessors inside the combat patrol, which we're using for the incursion here, and it's always important to keep one of these guys on your home objective at the very start of the game in order to lock it in under your control at the beginning, but then you can use them as utility units, either screening out enemy deep strikers in your back line, or moving forward to threaten opposing infantry, or even embarking into the impulsors in order to get them farther up the table and threaten control of objectives in the future. Intercessors are just a very useful unit, and especially if you have the impulsors moving back and forth towards the objectives to ferry your units around, they're going to be an incredibly effective second wave of attacks. Now with that, let's talk about expanding this incursion into a strike force size game. This is the 2,000 points level, and obviously is the standard points level for 40k that the game is designed around and that competitive play recommends you use. In this case, we've added quite a bit to the incursion-sized army. This includes the special character Vulcan Heston. This guy is going to be our combo enabler for our big, hefty, multi-melta attacks. He's going to be able to point at an enemy and grant you wound rerolls with your melta and your flamer weapons, and that synergizes absolutely incredibly with the mass multi-meltas that we have on units like our Invader ATVs, as well as our Stormspeeder Hammer Strike, which we'll discuss in a moment, as well as comboing extremely well with the flamer on the Land Raider Redeemer that we have right here. The army just generally tends to have a lot of random flame weapons, just being a Salamander's army. Vulcan Heston himself buffs his own hand flamer, as well as we have a Pyro Pistol and Adrax Agatone, which is also going to benefit from those rerolls, so it's definitely useful to have around basically regardless. Vulcan Heston's also incredibly difficult to kill and hits relatively hard in melee. He's just a good character all around and an incredible force multiplier. He has to expose himself into line of sight in order to use his special ability, so we've also included a company heroes unit to make him more difficult to kill. These guys are -1 to be wounded all the time and have a boatload of wounds, as well as some pretty good ranged attacks, so they're always nice to include into an army, and they make Vulcan Heston even better. Now with that, we've included an attachment unit for the Gravis Captain. This is a unit of aggressors with Flamestorm gauntlets. This is a particularly powerful unit inside the Firestorm Assault Force because of the Immolation Protocols stratagem. This stratagem gives you an uncapped number of devastating wounds to torrent weapons equipped by the unit. So in this case, we have 6 sets of twin-linked flamers, which will average somewhere around 7 or 8 mortal wounds once we're using that Immolation Protocols. It is a 2 CP stratagem, so we will oftentimes have to use our strat discount for it from the Gravis Captain's Rites of Battle. This is a difficult unit to get into the fight, so we're also including a Land Raider Redeemer, which has the necessary transport capacity to carry all of the aggressors around with it. It also has an assault ramp, so it's able to move and then disembark them. They're then able to shoot flamethrowers and people down with some twin-linked attacks, and then also potentially do mortal wounds with that Immolation Protocols, and then charge in using their twin-linked melee attacks, plus the Gravis Captain's melee attacks as well, for an insane amount of potential damage. The Land Raider Redeemer is also an incredibly useful unit, which I'll discuss momentarily once we talk about some combos we can use with it, alongside stratagems like Rapid Embarkation. And generally speaking, the game state that we're trying to construct with this army is one in which the Land Raider Redeemer is kind of our anchor point for the army, where we can kill all of the units that can threaten it, and it can dominate the center of the battlefield by itself. Now on top of that, we've also added some additional support units. This includes a unit of Incursors. These guys are going to be very important to buff up our Melta attacks. One thing that we don't want to be doing is necessarily using our Oaths of Moment on what our Melta weapons are going to be attacking, since they are going to get wound rerolls anyway and don't always need the +1 to wound, and oftentimes don't also need the +1 to hit either. This allows us to potentially use the Incursors to buff up whatever we're going to be shooting our Melta weapons at, because if the Incursors make a ranged attack against you and hit you, they can give you a +1 bonus to other units shooting at you. So for example, we can tag a unit with the Incursors, then run up all of our Invader ATVs in a little bit of a wolf pack, then point Vulcan Heston at that target and grant all of these little guys potentially +1 strength if they're within 12 inches, +1 to hit, and wound rerolls. So they're hitting on 2s, wounding most targets on 4s, and then wound rerolling as well, which is a huge amount of lethal damage. We then have a Stormspeeder Hammer Strike, which is doing largely the same thing. It has another set of 3 multi-Melta attacks with its big Melta Destroyer mounted to the front of the vehicle, so it can also synergize well with Vulcan Heston, and then it also has a variety of other weapons, and it can strip cover from one of the targets that it shoots, which then allows it to benefit the other Melta attacks or potentially our lighter units like our Hellblasters. So we have a lot of potential options for buffing our attacks between Vulcan, the Incursors, and the Stormspeeder Hammer Strike, plus the stratagems we have in Firestorm Assault Force. The other thing is that Vulcan Heston has huge synergy with the Land Raider Redeemer itself. This thing has a multi-melta attached to the top, so it's able to do basically the same thing that the Invader ATVs are doing already, especially once it gets up close and personal to a heavy target, but it also gains +1 strength when firing its Flamestorm cannons, because it's always going to be within 12 inches of its target. That puts it up to strength 7, meaning it's wounding basically everything in the game on no worse than 5s, and then you can buff that with potentially Crucible of Battle, Oath of Moment, and then also give it wound rerolls with Vulcan Heston. This fires 2d6 + 6 attacks that are wounding on 4s or 5s with full rerolls, auto-hitting, which is an immense amount of damage that not a lot of people expect from this little thing. These guys are very classic at killing light to medium infantry with extreme prejudice, but once you buff them up, they can also start killing larger units like Knights and other Land Raiders, which gets absolutely ludicrous once all of the benefits are added together. Now, when playing an army like this, one thing that I think is important to keep in mind is how valuable this Land Raider is. The Land Raider is the second most expensive unit in the army and is essentially ferrying around the most expensive unit in the army, that being the big brick of aggressors. So it's not something that you want to throw into the middle of the table and hope it survives, because while Land Raiders are difficult to kill, most armies at this points level are going to be able to find a way to remove them if they can stack enough buffs on them. And as I mentioned before, the Land Raider is a very valuable piece once it comes to the late game, because as you're dealing with your opponent's anti-tank as the game goes on, their capacity to destroy a Land Raider is reduced over the course of the game, and having this thing alive on Battle Round 4 or Battle Round 5, just to be able to move forward and torch enemies and threaten huge overwatches, is incredibly important. I would always try to find a piece of terrain where the Land Raider can threaten the center of the table, but isn't necessarily out in the open by itself. Something like this is particularly strong because it's difficult to get lines of sight on it, but it can still potentially disembark its aggressors and then run them into the middle of the table. It's important to keep in mind as well that both the Land Raider and its embarked occupants will have assault thanks to the detachment ability, so they're going to be able to advance and shoot, which can definitely help mitigate their relatively short range. So finding a place for the Land Raider to post up in the center of the table and then expose itself on a turn where your opponent doesn't have a lot that can attack it, or the classic Space Marine Go turn where you're exposing a lot of your army in order to try to deal a crippling blow to your opponent and stop them from being able to kill everything that you have on the crackback, is going to be very important. Now for the Impulsors, one interesting thing that we can do in this build in particular is swap out the Hellblasters being transported by one of the Impulsors with the Incursor squad. That grants the Impulsor the Incursor's 6-inch scout move, which gives it a move before the game begins, and potentially allows it to take up additional real estate outside of your deployment zone in more aggressive positions, where it can then go forward and act as a utility unit. You can even then use it to sort of stage your other units by moving it forward and disembarking the Incursors, and then trading them out for some other units as well. Now, once the Land Raider has disembarked its occupants, an interesting thing we can is actually use it as a ferry for Vulcan Heston. As I mentioned before, Vulcan Heston has to have line of sight to a target in order to use his buff on that target, so oftentimes he's going to be punishing enemies for moving forward, but that doesn't necessarily mean he has to stay in line of sight of that target. So one thing he can do is run out to a fairly aggressive position, use his buff on an enemy that's in the center of the table to allow your Meltas to kill it, and then use the rapid embarkation stratagem at the end of your turn to embark him into a nearby transport. Now in this case, unfortunately, he himself cannot embark into the Impulsors, since he's unfortunately not a Tacticus unit, he's a firstborn Space Marine, but he can embark into the Land Raider. So if the Land Raider's already disembarked its aggressors into an aggressive position, we can use it to then protect Vulcan Heston against counterattacks for the remainder of that turn by using Rapid Embarkation at the end of your turn. The other way that Rapid Embarkation is often used is to embark units into a transport at the end of your opponent's turn to then move them up the table or benefit from other effects that the transport has. So for example, if we are able to move up a unit like like our aggressors, to kill an enemy unit in the center of the battlefield, but keep them in a position where it's difficult for your opponent to get line of sight back to them. At the end of your opponent's turn, you can then use Rapid Embarkation to get them back into the transport, and then at your turn, you can then move the transport even farther forward and disembark them once again. That stratagem is very powerful, and as you get better at using an army like this, it's one of the most important components of the Firestorm Assault Force. Beyond that, we can keep our Stormspeeder Hammer Strike and Deep Strike for the situation where we needed to strip cover from a particular target. It's important to keep in mind that while this thing does have a Melt-A-Gun, it can also fire 36 inches with its missile launchers to ensure that it impacts a target that you want to strip cover from in order to get its buff off. On your big go turn, you can also potentially use it, jump down 9 inches away from an enemy in order to fire its Melta Destroyer, then also strip cover from another enemy with one of its other guns, and potentially get buffed by Vulcan Heston on the same turn. Keeping this thing in Deep Strike for flexibility is a huge benefit to this little guy. But with that, the game plan of this army is largely the same as the one that we just discussed. We want to be using our Impulsors, and our Scouts, and our Invader ATVs to threaten control of objectives and force our opponent to come fight in the center of the table. The Firestorm Assault Force is relatively fast, but it is short-ranged, and so really what it wants to do is brawl with its opponent in the center. If you can set up a situation where your opponent's forced to do that, you're going to be in a pretty good position, because the damage output from this army is absolutely ludicrous. The downside is that it's at such a short range that your opponent can sometimes poke away at it at a longer range. So ensuring that you set yourself up so that you have good terrain to stage your units around the table, putting yourself in a position where you can, for example, put an Impulsor with an embarked infantry unit onto an objective, lose the Impulsor but still retain control of the objective, will put you up on points, and that forces your opponent to come fight you. As long as you're forcing your opponent into a situation where they had to start trading blows with the Salamanders army, you're going to be in a pretty strong spot. But if they can stay back at the far side of the table and poke at you, you're going to have a tough time. As I mentioned at the start of the video, playing an army like Salamanders that's so dedicated to a particular game plan is going to be a little bit more difficult than playing a more flexible army, at least as a new player. But obviously, if you are dedicated to it and you are prepared to get a bunch of reps in to learn how an army like this functions, it is going to be fairly effective. And as I mentioned several times, the damage output from the Firestorm Assault Force can be absolutely ludicrous. As for ways to expand this army, there are a couple interesting combinations that you can use inside this detachment in particular that synergize with weapons that the Salamanders chapter like taking. Taking Firstborn units gives you a little bit more access to rapid embarkation targets that Vulcan Heston tends to enjoy. Things like Razorbacks and Rhinos with embarked Devastator squads, but packing multi-meltas gives you some more efficient access to multi-melta shooting, especially in high volume, which can be very powerful once you're combining those with things like the +1 to hit from Incursors and wound rerolls from Vulcan. They also give you transports that Vulcan can hop into, and one thing that's really interesting is playing him all by himself without any attached unit, and just using rapid embarkation to hop him in and out of transports between different turns. Another popular inclusion in a Firestorm Assault Force are units like Eradicators. Eradicators already have baked-in rerolls with their Melta weapons when firing at their preferred targets, monsters and vehicles, so they don't necessarily need Vulcan Heston's benefit to get the most out of themselves, but they can give you access to another rerolling unit without the need to use his ability. In addition, they also really appreciate getting +1 to strength and the assault that the detachment gives them. You can also use an attached character like an Apothecary Biologus to carry some really powerful enhancements for the unit. Things like Forged in Battle to automatically consider one of their rolls a 6 means that the unit is incredibly accurate, and when you combo that with a critical hit effect like the Apothecary Biologus' lethal hits, Eradicators can be really, really strong. Lastly, I would be remiss if I didn't discuss Inceptors. I think these are one of the stronger units in the Space Marine Codex, at least for their infantry options. They're a good sort of hybrid utility and combat unit. They're able to deep strike 6 inches away from enemies rather than 9 inches, which automatically means that they're going to be getting in close range for that +1 strength that the detachment ability gives them. Getting that +1 strength is incredibly important, especially for Assault Bolter equipped Inceptors, which puts them in a position where they're wounding a lot of infantry on 2s and even a lot of vehicles on 5s. And considering the fact that they're twin linked already, that means that their attacks are incredibly efficient. These guys are pretty good in most detachments, but they also have some special synergies with Firestorm Assault Force in particular, although they don't have anything special going on for Salamanders. They're just a useful unit to have around. Now, I'm recording this after the fact, but I also think it's important to discuss other detachments that you could be playing Salamanders inside. You aren't required to play Firestorm Assault Force when you play the chapter. It just has synergies with the Melta weapons and flamers that they typically like using and that Vulcan Heston can buff. enough. But an army list like the one that we built in this video can be transposed into other detachments. You can play it in a detachment like Gladius Task Force just fine without really changing too much, and it still benefits most of the units that we're including. You can also play the multiple small unit style of army, focusing on multi-melta equipped vehicles and smaller units like that, using Iron Storm Spearhead. That's also a pretty solid place to play things like Invader ATVs, Storm Speeder Hammer Strikes, and grant them additional efficiency with hit or wound rerolls on top of Vulcan buffing those units. And if you play more melee-oriented armies, obviously Adrex Agatone will benefit pretty significantly from any of those. So let me know down in the comment section what you think of this list, and which army or Space Marine chapter you'd like to see me talk about next in this video series. If you want to support me and help me make these videos, you can do so either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise. You can also join my YouTube channel membership with the link down below the video, and you can find me over on Twitch, where I live stream all my games over at twitch.tv/TacticalTortoiseTV. Thanks so much for watching all the way to the end of the video. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.